Gate 47 at Denver International Airport buzzed with typical pre-boarding energy. Passengers lined up with boarding passes, checking phones, adjusting carry-ons. The Williams family stood in the priority boarding line with their 3 children, dressed immaculately for what should have been a routine flight to Miami. Marcus Williams, a tall man in his early 40s, held boarding passes for first-class seats while his wife Angela gathered their twins' backpacks. Their teenage daughter Zoe scrolled through her phone. Their 8-year-old son Tyler clutched a small airplane toy, and baby Emma slipped peacefully in her carrier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
At 2:47 p.m., flight attendant Jessica Palmer approached the gate podium with a concerned expression that would trigger events no one could have predicted. Within minutes, a routine family vacation would become a crisis that grounded an entire aircraft and changed an airline forever. The Williams family vacation had been planned for months. Marcus had surprised Angela with first-class tickets to Miami for their 10th wedding anniversary, a celebration that would include the children and Angela's parents who lived in Fort Lauderdale. The tickets represented more than just comfortable seating. They symbolized how far Marcus had come from his childhood in Detroit, where family vacations meant driving to a lake 2 hours away and sleeping in tents. Angela adjusted Emma's carrier while keeping one eye on Tyler, who was making airplane noises with his toy. The boy's enthusiasm was infectious, and several passengers smiled at his excitement. Zoe, at 15, tried to maintain teenage composure, but Marcus could see her anticipation. This would be her first time in first class, her first trip to Florida, her first real family vacation that didn't involve visiting relatives. Marcus checked his phone for the 3rd time. Flight 892 to Miami was on schedule for a 3:15 departure. He had left work early, something he rarely did as regional sales director for a major pharmaceutical company. The quarterly reports could wait. Family came first, especially after the year they'd had. Angela's promotion to senior nurse supervisor at Denver General had been demanding, and Marcus's territory expansion had kept him traveling 3 weeks out of every month. The gate area filled with passengers as boarding time approached. Marcus noticed the usual mix of business travelers, families, and vacation-goers. He felt a sense of satisfaction seeing his family dressed well, behaving appropriately, belonging in this environment. Angela wore a navy blazer with white pants, looking every bit the healthcare professional she was. The children were dressed in coordinated outfits Angela had carefully selected for their first-class experience. At 2:45, the gate agent announced pre-boarding for passengers requiring assistance, followed by first-class and premium members. Marcus gathered their carry-on bags while Angela organized the children. They had practiced this moment at home, wanting everything to go smoothly. Tyler understood he needed to walk calmly. Zoe had her headphones ready, and Angela had prepared bottles and snacks for Emma. The family approached the gate agent, a middle-aged white woman named Patricia Stevens, who had worked for Mountain Airways for 12 years. Marcus handed over their boarding passes with a polite smile, expecting the routine scan and welcome aboard greeting he'd received countless times during business travel. Patricia examined the boarding passes with unusual scrutiny, her expression shifting from professional courtesy to something resembling suspicion. She looked up at Marcus, then at Angela and the children, then back at the boarding passes. The scanning device beeped as she ran each pass through multiple times. Marcus felt a familiar tension in his stomach, the same feeling he'd experienced in countless professional situations where his presence seemed to surprise people. He had learned to recognize the look, the momentary confusion when his appearance didn't match someone's expectations. Usually, it passed quickly once he spoke, once his education and professionalism became apparent. Patricia called over Jessica Palmer, the lead flight attendant, a woman in her 30s with short blonde hair and a demeanor that seemed perpetually stressed. Jessica approached with quick steps, her mouth already forming words of concern before she reached the gate. "There seems to be an issue with these boarding passes," Patricia said, loud enough for passengers in line behind the Williams family to hear. Jessica took the passes, examining them with the same exaggerated care Patricia had used. She looked at Marcus, then at Angela, then counted the children. Marcus felt Angela tense beside him. She had experienced this before too, though usually in medical settings where patients questioned her authority or colleagues assumed she was a nurse's aide rather than a supervisor. They had discussed these moments during their marriage, developing strategies to remain calm and professional while addressing the situation directly. "The boarding passes were purchased through our corporate travel system," Marcus said evenly. "Is there a specific problem you've identified?" Jessica and Patricia exchanged glances, the kind of wordless communication that suggested they were dealing with a familiar situation. Other passengers began shifting impatiently behind the Williams family, checking their phones and looking at their watches. "We need to verify the payment method," Jessica said, as if reading from a script. "Company policy requires additional verification for certain first-class reservations." She said this loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, creating an atmosphere of suspicion around the family. Marcus reached for his wallet, producing his corporate American Express card, the same card he used for all business travel. The name on the card clearly matched his identification, which he also provided without being asked. Angela watched this exchange with growing concern, recognizing the pattern from stories shared by friends and colleagues.
Tyler tugged on Marcus's jacket. "Daddy, are we getting on the airplane now?" The 8-year-old's innocent question seemed to amplify the tension. Other passengers were staring now, some with sympathy, others with impatience, a few with barely concealed judgment. Jessica studied Marcus's identification with theatrical thoroughness, as if examining evidence of a crime. She called Patricia over again, and they engaged in whispered conversation while the Williams family stood waiting. The gate area's natural buzz quieted as more people became aware of the situation unfolding. Angela stepped forward with the calm authority she used in medical emergencies. "Is there a specific company policy you can reference? We have connecting flights and hotel reservations that depend on making this departure time." Her voice carried the confidence of someone accustomed to managing crisis situations. "Ma'am, we're just following standard verification procedures," Jessica replied, but her tone suggested Angela's question was somehow inappropriate. "These things take time when there are irregularities." "What irregularities?" Marcus asked, his voice remaining level despite growing frustration. "You have our identification, our boarding passes, and our payment information. Everything matches, and everything is valid." The situation attracted attention from other Mountain Airways employees. A gate supervisor named Robert Chen approached, drawn by the delay and the growing crowd of onlookers. Jessica briefed him quickly, describing the Williams family as uncooperative passengers who were refusing to comply with verification procedures. Marcus felt the moment crystallizing, the same way business negotiations sometimes reached a point where positions became entrenched. He had built his career on reading rooms, understanding when to push and when to yield, when to escalate and when to de-escalate. This situation was escalating despite his attempts to remain cooperative. Angela noticed passengers recording with their phones. In 2024, every public confrontation became potential viral content, and she worried about her children being exposed to social media scrutiny. Zoe had noticed the phones too, and was looking uncomfortable, her teenage awareness making her acutely conscious of being watched. "Sir," Robert Chen said, approaching Marcus with professional courtesy that felt forced, "we're going to need you and your family to step aside while we resolve this matter. We have other passengers waiting to board." "Step aside to where?" Marcus asked. We have valid tickets for this flight. Just to the side of the gate area, Robert gestured, vaguely, until we can complete verification. How long will this verification take? Angela asked, Emma beginning to fuss in her carrier. We have 3 young children and are connecting flights in Miami. It will take as long as it takes, Jessica interjected, her patience clearly wearing thin. We can't compromise security for anyone's convenience. Security? Marcus repeated, the word hanging in the air like an accusation. What security concern could our family possibly represent? The question went unanswered, as Jessica, Patricia, and Robert huddled for another whispered conference. Marcus felt the eyes of dozens of passengers watching this scene unfold. Some looked sympathetic, others appeared annoyed by the delay, and a few seemed to be enjoying the drama. Tyler was getting restless, his earlier excitement fading into confusion. Why aren't we getting on the airplane, Mommy? Angela knelt down to comfort him while maintaining her composure, a skill developed through years of managing pediatric patients in anxious families. Marcus made a decision that would prove pivotal. He would not step aside. He would not accept vague explanations about verification procedures. He would not allow his family to be treated as suspects for the crime of purchasing first-class tickets while being black. We're not moving, he said quietly but firmly. We have valid tickets, valid identification, and valid payment. If you have specific concerns, articulate them clearly. Otherwise, we're boarding this aircraft with the other first-class passengers. The words carried weight that surprised even Marcus. In boardrooms, when he took similar stands, deals worth millions of dollars shifted direction. Here, in an airport gate area, those words would trigger events that would go far beyond a single delayed flight. Jessica's face flushed with anger, and something resembling panic. Sir, you're now being uncooperative and potentially disruptive. I'm going to have to call security. Call whoever you need to call. We'll be standing right here with our valid tickets waiting to board our flight. The standoff was set. On one side, a black family with legitimate tickets trying to board a plane for their vacation. On the other, airline employees who had created a problem that was rapidly spiraling beyond their control. Between them, dozens of passengers with phones, witnessing an incident that would soon reach far beyond Gate 47 at Denver International Airport. Marcus felt Angela's hand squeeze his arm, a silent signal of support. Zoe moved closer to her parents, teenage embarrassment replaced by family loyalty. Tyler continued playing with his airplane, oblivious to the gravity of the situation unfolding around him. Emma slept peacefully, unaware that her family's vacation was about to become something much more significant.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you were enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The gate area hummed with tension as passengers waited to see what would happen next. Some continued recording, others whispered among themselves, and a few made phone calls to report the delay. None of them knew they were witnessing the beginning of events that would reshape how an entire industry thought about customer service, dignity, and justice. Jessica reached for her radio, preparing to escalate a situation that had already gone too far. Marcus stood firm, knowing that backing down now would validate every assumption that had led to this moment. Angela maintained her protective stance around the children while preparing for whatever came next. The Williams family's vacation had not yet begun, but their fight for dignity and respect was already underway. Security officer Daniel Rodriguez arrived at Gate 47 within 3 minutes of Jessica's radio call. A former military police officer with 8 years of airport security experience, Rodriguez had handled hundreds of passenger disputes. He approached the situation with professional caution, noting the well-dressed family, the growing crowd of onlookers, and the obvious tension among the airline staff. "What seems to be the problem here?" Rodriguez asked, his tone neutral but authoritative. He positioned himself between the Williams family and the gate area, a subtle but significant choice that immediately established whose side he was presumed to be on. Jessica stepped forward eagerly, clearly relieved to have backup. "We have passengers who are refusing to comply with standard verification procedures. They're being disruptive and preventing other passengers from boarding."
Her voice carried the practiced urgency of someone who had learned to frame situations in terms that justified her actions. Rodriguez looked at Marcus, taking in his expensive suit, confident posture, and calm demeanor. This didn't match the typical profile of a disruptive passenger. "Sir, can you tell me what's happening from your perspective?" Marcus appreciated the officer's professional approach. "We purchased first-class tickets for our family vacation. We've provided identification, boarding passes, and payment verification. The airline staff is subjecting us to additional scrutiny that doesn't appear to be applied to other passengers. We're simply asking to board our flight." Rodriguez examined the documentation Marcus offered. Everything appeared legitimate. The boarding passes were genuine Mountain Airways tickets, the identification matched, and the corporate credit card showed Marcus Williams as an authorized user. "What additional verification are you requiring?" he asked Jessica. "Company policy mandates enhanced screening for certain high-value purchases," Jessica replied, but her explanation sounded rehearsed and vague. "We need to ensure ticket authenticity and passenger eligibility for premium cabin services." "What makes this purchase require enhanced screening?" Rodriguez pressed. "The tickets were purchased through a corporate travel system, the payment was processed successfully, and all documentation appears valid." Meanwhile, the delayed boarding was creating ripple effects throughout the gate area. Other first-class passengers grew increasingly impatient, checking their watches and making comments about missing connections. Business traveler Kenneth Walsh, a frequent flyer with executive status, approached the gate podium with visible frustration. "This is completely unacceptable," Walsh announced to Patricia Stevens. "I have platinum status with this airline and a crucial meeting in Miami. Whatever this issue is, can't you move these people aside and board the rest of us?" His suggestion carried the casual entitlement of someone accustomed to having problems solved at others' expense. Patricia nodded sympathetically. "We're trying to resolve this as quickly as possible, sir. We appreciate your patience during this unusual situation." Her tone suggested that the Williams family represented an aberration in the normally smooth operation of premium travel. Angela Williams listened to this exchange with growing anger. She had worked in healthcare long enough to recognize institutional bias when she saw it. The same patterns that led to Black patients receiving substandard care were playing out in this airline gate. The assumption that problems were caused by the Black family rather than the system designed to exclude them. "Officer Rodriguez," Angela said, stepping forward with the authority she wielded in medical emergencies, "I'm a senior nurse supervisor at General Hospital. I understand institutional protocols and the need for security measures. What I don't understand is why our family is being subjected to verification procedures that other passengers aren't experiencing. Can you help us understand the specific policy being applied here?" Rodriguez found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. His training emphasized de-escalation and conflict resolution, but the airline staff seemed determined to escalate rather than resolve. The family appeared completely legitimate, their documentation was in order, and their behavior was exemplary. Yet the airline insisted on treating them as potential threats or fraudsters. Jessica realized her position was weakening and decided to escalate further. She radioed for her supervisor, Flight Service Manager Linda Thompson, a 20-year veteran of Mountain Airways known for her rigid adherence to company policies. Thompson arrived with the bearing of someone accustomed to having her authority respected without question. "What's the situation?" Thompson asked, surveying the scene with practiced efficiency. She noted the security presence, the waiting passengers, and the growing crowd of onlookers. Jessica briefed her quickly, emphasizing the family's alleged non-cooperative behavior while minimizing the questionable verification demands. Thompson approached Marcus with professional courtesy that felt hollow. "Sir, I understand there's been some confusion about boarding procedures. We're just trying to follow company protocols to ensure everyone's safety and security. I'm sure we can resolve this as quickly as possible if everyone cooperates." "Ma'am," Marcus replied, maintaining his composure despite growing frustration, "we've purchased first-class tickets for our family vacation. We provided identification, boarding passes, and payment verification. The airline staff is subjecting us to additional scrutiny that doesn't appear to be applied to other passengers. We're simply asking to board our flight." The question hung in the air like an indictment. Thompson realized she was being asked to articulate what everyone understood, but no one wanted to acknowledge. The Williams family was being treated differently because they were Black, and that differential treatment had no legitimate policy justification. Company policy requires verification in certain circumstances, Thompson said, falling back on vague institutional language. We appreciate your patience while we complete our procedures. Zoe Williams, who had been quietly observing the exchange, stepped closer to her parents. At 15, she understood exactly what was happening. She had studied civil rights history in school, had heard family stories about her grandparents' experiences with segregation, and had personally encountered subtle racism in her predominantly white high school. This wasn't history. This was happening to her family right now. "Mom," Zoe whispered to her Angela, "this is because we're black, isn't it?" The teenager's direct question cut through the adult's careful diplomatic language, stating the obvious truth that everyone was dancing around. Angela put her arm around her daughter, feeling the weight of having to explain racial bias to her children during what should have been a joyful family vacation. "Yes, sweetheart," she said quietly but clearly. "This is exactly what we've talked about. Some people make assumptions based on how we look rather than who we are." Tyler, still holding his toy airplane, looked up at the adults with growing confusion. "Why don't they want us on the airplane, Daddy? Are we bad people?" The 8-year-old's innocent question was devastating in its simplicity, cutting through layers of institutional euphemism to reveal the human impact of discrimination. Marcus kneeled down to his son's level, aware that dozens of people were watching and recording this intimate family moment. "Tyler, we're not bad people. We're good people who paid for tickets just like everyone else. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes about other people, and we have to help them understand those mistakes."
The exchange was captured on multiple phones, creating a powerful visual narrative of a father explaining discrimination to his young son while being discriminated against. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the scene's moral clarity and their own complicity as bystanders. Officer Rodriguez found himself questioning everything about the situation. His job was to maintain order and security, but the real threat to order was coming from the airline staff, not the family they were targeting. The Williams family posed no security risk, had violated no regulations, and was behaving with remarkable patience under increasingly provocative circumstances. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said to Thompson, "I need you to specify exactly which company policy requires this additional verification. If there's a legitimate security concern, I need to understand it. If there isn't, we need to resolve this situation and allow these passengers to board their flight." Thompson felt the walls closing in. She could cite vague policies about fraud prevention and security protocols, but none of them actually applied to the Williams family's situation. The corporate training manual contained procedures for dealing with suspicious transactions, invalid documentation, and disruptive behavior, but the Williams family fit none of those categories. While Thompson struggled to justify her position, Captain Michael Stevens emerged from the cockpit. At 52, Stevens had logged 25,000 flight hours and prided himself on maintaining schedule adherence. The boarding delay was affecting his on-time performance metrics, and he wanted the situation resolved quickly. "What's causing the delay?" Stevens asked, approaching the gate area with visible impatience. He surveyed the scene, taking in the security presence, the waiting passengers, and the family at the center of the controversy. Thompson briefed him rapidly, describing passenger verification procedures and cooperation issues. Stevens listened with half his attention, more concerned about departure times than passenger relations details. He had dealt with difficult passengers before and had little patience for situations that threatened operational efficiency. "Folks," Stevens announced to the Williams family, "I'm Captain Stevens, and we need to get this flight moving. Whatever documentation issues we're having, we can sort them out once we're airborne. Right now, I need everyone to cooperate so we can maintain our schedule." "Captain," Marcus replied, "we're happy to cooperate. We've provided all requested documentation and are simply waiting to board with our valid tickets. The delay isn't being caused by our lack of cooperation." Stevens found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to choose between supporting his crew's actions and maintaining operational efficiency. The family appeared legitimate, but his staff insisted on additional verification.
Company policy emphasized crew support, but it also emphasized customer service and schedule adherence. The situation was complicated by the growing media attention. Passengers had been posting about the incident on social media for the past 10 minutes, and videos of the confrontation were already circulating online. Stevens recognized that this could quickly become a public relations problem that extended far beyond Gate 47. "Let me see your documentation," Stevens said to Marcus, hoping to quickly resolve whatever verification issues existed. Marcus handed over the boarding passes, identification, and credit card that had already been examined multiple times. Stevens studied them briefly, finding nothing problematic. "This all looks legitimate," Stevens announced, his statement carrying weight that contradicted his crew's position. "What specific verification procedures are outstanding?" Jessica and Thompson exchanged glances, realizing their captain had just undermined their justification for the delay. They had painted the Williams family as problematic passengers with questionable documentation, but Stevens had just validated everything the family had been saying. The tide was beginning to turn, but the institutional momentum of discrimination was difficult to stop once it had begun. Thompson made a decision that would prove catastrophic for everyone involved. Instead of backing down and allowing the family to board, she chose to double down on her authority. "Captain, company policy requires completion of all verification procedures before boarding, regardless of how the documentation appears. We cannot compromise our security protocols for operational convenience." Her words committed Mountain Airways to a position that would soon prove impossible to defend. Stevens nodded reluctantly, unwilling to publicly contradict his crew despite his private doubts. The Williams family watched this exchange with growing understanding that they were caught in an institutional process that had taken on its own momentum, independent of logic or fairness. Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He reached for his phone not to make a call, but to check a message he had received during the confrontation. The text was simple but explosive. "Private jet ready for departure. Terminal B, Gate 12. Your call, boss." It was signed with initials that would soon change everything. T.M. Thomas Morrison, Chief Operating Officer of Williams Aviation Holdings. Marcus looked up from his phone, his expression shifting from patient endurance to something that Angela took notice. After 12 years of marriage, she could read his moods and knew something significant had just shifted. Marcus looked up from his phone with a slight smile that none of the airline staff recognized as dangerous. The Williams family was about to transform from victims of discrimination into something much more powerful. But first, they would have to endure a few more minutes of institutional bias that was about to expose itself completely. Captain Stevens made his choice, and it was the wrong one. The message on Marcus's phone was simple but explosive. "Private jet ready for departure. Terminal B, Gate 12. Your call, boss." It was signed with initials that would soon change everything. T.M. Thomas Morrison, Chief Operating Officer of Williams Aviation Holdings. Marcus looked up from his phone, his expression shifting from patient endurance to something that Angela took notice. After 12 years of marriage, she could read his moods and knew he wore the look during major business negotiations when he was about to reveal a position that would fundamentally alter the balance of power. Captain Stevens was growing increasingly impatient with the standoff. His on-time departure record was being damaged by what appeared to be a simple documentation issue that his crew seemed unable to resolve efficiently. The gate area was filled with frustrated passengers, social media posts were multiplying, and his dispatcher was radioing about air traffic control slot times. "Look," Stevens said with forced authority, "we need to resolve this situation immediately. Either these passengers comply with verification procedures and board, or they need to make alternative travel arrangements. We cannot delay this flight any longer." Thompson nodded vigorously, feeling supported by her captain's ultimatum. "Sir," she said to Marcus, "you have two choices. Complete our verification process or leave the gate area. We cannot accommodate further delays. Marcus smiled slightly, the expression making Angela's pulse quicken. She had seen that smile during contract negotiations worth millions of dollars, during hostile takeover attempts, during congressional testimony about aviation industry regulations. It was the smile of a man who was about to reveal information that would fundamentally alter the balance of power. Miss Thompson, I appreciate your commitment to policies. However, I think there's something you should know before we proceed further. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a leather credential case, the kind carried by federal inspectors and senior corporate executives. The gate area fell silent as Marcus opened the case deliberately, revealing an ID card with his photograph and official corporate letterhead. The words were clearly visible: Williams Aviation Holdings, Chairman and CEO. My name is Marcus Williams. I am the Chairman and CEO of Williams Aviation Holdings, the parent company that owns 47% of Mountain Airways stock and holds 3 seats on your board of directors.
The silence was profound and immediate. Captain Stevens stared at the identification card as if it might disappear. Thompson's face went through several color changes before settling on pale gray. Jessica Palmer looked like she had been struck by lightning. Rodriguez examined the ID carefully, recognizing the authentic watermarks and security features of corporate executive credentials. This wasn't a fake document or an elaborate hoax. The man they had been treating as a potential fraud was actually one of the most powerful people in the aviation industry. Officer Rodriguez stepped forward, his professional demeanor intact, but his understanding of the situation completely transformed. Sir, this is legitimate Federal Aviation Authority identification. This gentleman is exactly who he claims to be. The revelation rippled through the crowd of onlookers like electricity. Passengers who had been recording the incident suddenly realized they had captured something far more significant than a routine discrimination case. They had documented a major airline staff discriminating against their own company's chairman. Angela watched the airline employees' faces with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She felt vindicated that their treatment had been revealed as unjustified, but disappointed that it had taken Marcus's corporate power to achieve basic dignity. The same behavior that was unacceptable when directed at a pharmaceutical sales executive somehow became catastrophic when the target was revealed to be an aviation industry leader. Zoe stepped closer to her father, teenage pride mixing with sophisticated understanding of power dynamics. She had known her father was successful, but seeing airline employees realize they had been discriminating against their own boss provided a stark lesson in how authority and respect operated in the real world. Tyler looked up at his father with new confusion. "Daddy, do you own the airplane?" The 8-year-old's question cut through the adult tension with innocent clarity, highlighting the absurdity of trying to prevent the airline's owner from boarding his own aircraft. Captain Stevens felt his career flashing before his eyes. 25 years of flying, thousands of hours in the cockpit, an unblemished safety record, all potentially destroyed by 15 minutes of supporting discriminatory policies. He recognized that everything he said and did in the next few minutes would determine whether he continued working in aviation. "Mr. Williams," Stevens said, his voice barely steady, "I had no idea who you were. If I had known, this situation would never have occurred." "Captain Stevens," Marcus replied, his tone remaining calm but carrying new authority. "That statement reveals exactly the problem we're dealing with. Your treatment of my family shouldn't depend on my corporate position. Every passenger deserves the same dignity and respect, regardless of their social status or economic power." The gate area buzzed with urgent whispered conversations as passengers processed what they were witnessing. Business travelers who had complained about delays suddenly found themselves sympathetic to the Williams family's situation. Social media posts were being frantically edited as people realized they had documented a historic moment in aviation civil rights. Thompson tried desperately to salvage her position. "Mr. Williams, please understand that we were simply following established company protocols. There was no intent to discriminate or cause offense. We treat all passengers with the same verification procedures." "Ms. Thompson," Marcus interrupted, "those protocols were applied selectively to my family based on assumptions about who belongs in first class. You subjected us to additional scrutiny that white passengers didn't experience, questioned our right to occupy seats we purchased legitimately, and created a hostile environment that my children will remember for the rest of their lives." He paused, letting the implications settle over the assembled crowd. "More importantly, you demonstrated exactly the kind of systematic bias that affects thousands of passengers who don't happen to own airline stock. Your actions today represent not just poor customer service, but a violation of basic civil rights principles." Rodriguez found himself in the unusual position of witnessing corporate justice in real time. His law enforcement training had taught him to recognize abuse of authority, and he was seeing it from both sides. The airline staff had abused their authority to discriminate against passengers, while Marcus Williams was about to use his corporate authority to demand accountability. The PA system crackled with an announcement that sent additional shockwaves through Gate 47. "Attention passengers of Flight 892. This is Margaret Chen, Vice President of Operations from Mountain Airways. We have been monitoring this situation through real-time security feeds and passenger communications. All boarding procedures for Flight 892 are suspended pending immediate investigation." Stevens realized that corporate headquarters had been watching the entire incident unfold through security cameras and social media feeds. His career wasn't just in jeopardy, it was effectively over. The airline industry was small, and news of discriminating against Williams Aviation Holdings chairman would follow him to any potential future employer. Jessica Palmer finally spoke, her voice shaking with the recognition of what she had done. "Mr. Williams, I sincerely apologize for any misunderstanding. We never intended for this situation to escalate. We were just trying to be thorough in our security procedures." "Ms. Thompson," Marcus replied, "there was no misunderstanding. You and your colleagues made deliberate choices based on racial assumptions. You saw a black family with first-class tickets and decided we required additional scrutiny that white passengers didn't experience. You questioned our right to occupy seats we purchased legitimately and created a hostile environment that my children will remember for the rest of their lives." He paused, letting the implications settle over the assembled crowd. "More importantly, you demonstrated exactly the kind of systematic bias that affects thousands of passengers who don't happen to own airline stock. Your actions today represent not just poor customer service, but a violation of basic civil rights principles." Rodriguez found himself in the unusual position of witnessing corporate justice in real time. His law enforcement training had taught him to recognize abuse of authority, and he was seeing it from both sides. The airline staff had abused their authority to discriminate against passengers, while Marcus Williams was about to use his corporate authority to demand accountability. The PA system crackled with another announcement that would reshape the aviation industry. "Mr. Williams, this is Margaret Chen. Williams Aviation Holdings corporate jet is being prepared for immediate departure. Please proceed to Terminal B, Gate 12, where our senior staff will ensure your family receives the treatment you deserved from the beginning." The announcement confirmed what many passengers had suspected but hadn't dared to believe. Marcus Williams wasn't just a successful businessman who happened to own airline stock. He was powerful enough to command corporate jets and executive attention with a single phone call. Captain Stevens made a last desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his career. Mr. Williams, on behalf of Mountain Airways, I want to apologize for this entire incident. We clearly failed to meet our customer service standards, and I take full responsibility for my crew's actions. Captain Stevens, Marcus replied, your apology is noted, but accountability requires more than words. You supported discriminatory treatment of passengers under your command. You prioritized crew solidarity over passenger rights. Most importantly, you demonstrated that airline authority can be used to perpetuate institutional bias rather than prevent it. Officer Rodriguez stepped forward as the family prepared to leave. Mr. Williams, for what it's worth, your family handled this situation with remarkable dignity. You've given everyone here a lesson in how to respond to discrimination with strength and grace.
Officer Rodriguez, Marcus replied, thank you for your professionalism throughout this incident. Your conduct showed that institutional authority can be used to protect rights rather than violate them. As the Williams family gathered their belongings, the gate area remained transfixed by what they had witnessed. Passengers continued recording as Marcus, Angela, Zoe, Tyler, and baby Emma walked away from Gate 47, leaving behind airline employees whose careers had just been destroyed and a crowd of witnesses who had seen corporate power used for civil rights rather than personal revenge. The family's departure marked the end of their victimization, but the beginning of a reckoning that would transform an entire industry. Within hours, the incident would be trending on every social media platform, generating headlines in major newspapers and prompting congressional inquiries into systematic airline discrimination. Marcus Williams had boarded Mountain Airways as a passenger and been treated as a suspect. He was leaving as a civil rights advocate with the power to reshape how airlines treated every passenger who followed. The real flight was just beginning. The Williams family's walk through Denver International Airport to Terminal B became a procession of recognition and whispered conversations. Passengers who had witnessed the incident at Gate 47 pulled out phones to capture their departure, while others who had seen social media posts began recognizing them in real time. Airport staff stepped aside respectfully, word having spread through internal communications that the chairman of Williams Aviation Holdings was moving through their facility. At Terminal B, Gate 12, a very different scene awaited them. Senior Mountain Airways executives had arrived within minutes of Margaret Chen's announcement, led by Regional Vice President David Park and Customer Experience Director Sarah Foster. Both executives displayed the urgent deference reserved for their most important stakeholders, but their expressions carried the weight of managing a corporate crisis that threatened to destroy careers and reshape industry practices. Park approached the family with carefully rehearsed apologies. Mr. Williams, on behalf of Mountain Airways and our parent company relationship, I want to express our deepest regret for the completely unacceptable treatment your family received today. We are conducting immediate investigations and implementing corrective measures to ensure this never happens again. Marcus listened to the corporate response with the patience of someone who understood institutional damage control. Mr. Park, your response is noted and appreciated. However, accountability requires understanding that this incident wasn't an isolated mistake by individual employees. It represents systematic problems in training, culture, and oversight that affect thousands of passengers who lack my corporate position. Angela stood beside her husband, still processing the rapid transformation from discrimination victims to VIP treatment. The contrast was stark and educational. The same airline that had questioned their right to board was now providing executive escorts and priority services. The differential treatment proved Marcus's point about institutional bias more effectively than any corporate training program could. Meanwhile, back at Gate 47, the aftermath was unfolding with swift corporate precision. Captain Stevens found himself escorted to Mountain Airways Operations Center by two company security officers, his pilot's credentials suspended pending investigation. Flight Service Manager Thompson and lead flight attendant Palmer were similarly removed from duty, their access badges deactivated, and personal belongings collected under supervision. The remaining passengers on Flight 892 were informed that departure would be delayed indefinitely, while the airline secured replacement crew members. Many passengers, having witnessed the discrimination incident firsthand, expressed support for the delay and the accountability measures being implemented. Social media posts from Gate 47 showed unusual solidarity among travelers who recognized that they had seen something historically significant. Thomas Morrison, Chief Operating Officer of Williams Aviation Holdings, arrived at Gate 12 with a team of corporate attorneys and public relations specialists. As Marcus's senior deputy, Morrison had been monitoring the situation remotely and coordinating strategies while the family endured discrimination. His presence signaled that this incident would be treated as a major corporate crisis, requiring comprehensive institutional response. "Tom," Marcus said, greeting his longtime business partner and friend, "thank you for arranging alternative transportation. I think it's important that we document every aspect of today's events for future training and policy development." Morrison nodded grimly. "Marcus, we've been recording everything through security feeds and social media monitoring. The legal team is already preparing comprehensive documentation for multiple investigations. This incident will drive industry-wide reforms, but the immediate priority is ensuring your family's comfort and safety." Tyler Williams, still holding his toy airplane, looked around at the corporate executives with wide-eyed fascination. The 8-year-old didn't understand the business implications of what was happening, but he could sense that his father was very important to these people who were treating their family like royalty. "Are we going to fly in your airplane now, Daddy?" Tyler asked, his innocent question drawing smiles from the assembled executives despite the serious circumstances. The child's excitement provided a humanizing contrast to the corporate crisis management surrounding them. "Yes, buddy," Marcus replied, kneeling down to his son's level. "We're going to take our own airplane to Miami, and it's going to be even better than the first-class seats we bought on the other plane." Angela Williams observed the executive dynamics with the sharp awareness of a 15-year-old who understood power structures. She had watched her father transform from discrimination victim to corporate authority in the span of 30 minutes, providing her with a real-world education in how institutional power operated and could be leveraged for justice. The corporate jet waiting at Gate 12 was a Gulfstream G650, one of 3 aircraft in Williams Aviation Holdings' executive fleet. The plane represented more than luxury transportation. It symbolized the economic power that could challenge institutional discrimination when properly deployed. Crew members greeted the Williams family with genuine respect and professional courtesy that contrasted sharply with their treatment at Mountain Airways. Captain Jennifer Walsh, who commanded Williams Aviation Holdings' corporate fleet, briefed the family personally on flight plans and amenities. Her professionalism highlighted the difference between service based on respect versus service motivated by fear of consequences. The corporate flight crew treated the Williams family as valued passengers rather than potential threats requiring additional verification. While the family boarded their corporate jet, emergency meetings were convened throughout Mountain Airways' corporate structure. CEO Patricia Williams, no relation to Marcus Williams, had been awakened at her Connecticut home by panicked calls from senior staff describing the discrimination incident and its potential legal and financial implications. The airline's legal department was already analyzing liability exposure for civil rights violations, while the public relations team monitored social media feeds showing millions of views for videos documenting the incident. Stock market analysts were projecting potential financial impact from boycotts, litigation, and regulatory sanctions that could result from the discrimination case. Regional Operations Director Michael Brooks convened disciplinary hearings for Captain Stevens, Thompson, and Palmer within 2 hours of the incident. The 3 employees sat in separate conference rooms, each facing career termination and potential legal consequences for their role in discriminating against one of the aviation industry's most powerful executives. Brooks addressed Captain Stevens first, laying out the scope of the disaster he helped create. "David, in 28 years with this company, I've never seen anything like this. You supported crew members who discriminated against the chairman of our parent company's board of directors.
The FAA is opening an investigation, the Department of Transportation is reviewing our civil rights compliance, and Congress is demanding testimony about systematic airline discrimination. Stevens sat in stunned silence, recognizing that his aviation career was effectively over. The incident would follow him to any potential employer, and his decision to support discriminatory crew actions would be documented in federal investigations and court proceedings. 25 years of professional achievement had been destroyed by 15 minutes of poor judgment.
Thompson and Palmer faced similar reckonings in parallel disciplinary sessions. Both women realized they had not only lost their jobs, but had become symbols of institutional bias that would follow them indefinitely. Their names would be associated with one of the most documented discrimination cases in aviation history. The broader implications extended far beyond individual career destruction. Mountain Airways faced potential federal investigations, congressional hearings, civil rights lawsuits, and shareholder litigation that could cost hundreds of millions of dollars. More significantly, the incident was generating industry-wide scrutiny of airline discrimination practices that had operated without oversight for decades. As the Williams family's corporate jet lifted off from Denver, heading toward Miami with a flight time of 3 hours, Marcus began drafting communication strategies that would transform the discrimination incident into comprehensive industry reform. His position as Williams Aviation Holdings chairman provided him with unprecedented leverage to demand systematic changes across the aviation sector. Angela settled into the corporate jet's luxury seating with mixed emotions. She felt vindicated that their treatment had been exposed as unjustified, but troubled that it had required Marcus's corporate power to achieve basic dignity. The experience reinforced her understanding that institutional bias affected millions of people who lacked the resources to fight back effectively. The corporate jet's communication systems allowed Marcus to monitor real-time developments from the discrimination incident. Social media feeds showed #DenverDiscrimination is trending globally, with millions of users sharing their own experiences of airline bias. News organizations were picking up the story, and civil rights leaders were calling for comprehensive aviation industry reforms. Margaret Chen, Mountain Airways Vice President of Operations, briefed Marcus via secure communication during the flight. "Mr. Williams, we've terminated the 3 employees directly involved in the discrimination incident. We're implementing immediate bias training for all customer-facing staff and revising our passenger treatment protocols. The board of directors has called an emergency meeting to address systematic discrimination issues." Marcus listened to Chen's update while Tyler played with his toy airplane and Zoe documented their corporate jet experience on social media. "Ms. Chen," he replied, "terminating individual employees addresses symptoms rather than causes. The real issue is institutional culture that enables discrimination to flourish without oversight. We need comprehensive reforms that prevent these incidents rather than simply punishing them after they occur." The flight to Miami provided the Williams family with time to process their experience and plan responses that would extend far beyond personal justice. Marcus understood that his corporate position created an opportunity to address systematic airline discrimination that affected millions of travelers who would never have his resources or authority. As they descended toward Miami International Airport, the Williams family prepared to transform a personal experience of discrimination into a movement for comprehensive civil rights reform across the aviation industry. The immediate accountability phase was complete, but the real work of institutional change was just beginning. The Williams Aviation Holdings corporate jet touched down at Miami International Airport at 6:30 p.m., 3 hours after the discrimination incident at Denver. During the flight, Marcus had conducted secure conference calls with federal aviation officials, congressional staff members, and civil rights organizations, transforming a personal experience of bias into the foundation for comprehensive industry reform. Angela gathered their children's belongings while observing how different their arrival experience was compared to their attempted departure from Denver. Miami airport personnel greeted them with professional courtesy based on respect rather than fear, highlighting the contrast between authentic customer service and the discriminatory treatment they had endured hours earlier. Within the corporate jet's communication center, Marcus had been coordinating with his legal team to document every aspect of the discrimination incident for multiple investigations already underway. Federal Aviation Administration officials had contacted Williams Aviation Holdings directly, seeking comprehensive briefings on systematic airline bias that the Denver incident had exposed. The family's hotel suite at the Ritz-Carlton in South Beach provided a temporary headquarters for what was rapidly becoming a national civil rights campaign. While Tyler played with his toy airplane on the balcony overlooking Biscayne Bay and baby Emma napped peacefully, Marcus began drafting policy recommendations that would reshape how airlines approached passenger relations. By 8 p.m., the discrimination incident had generated over 50 million social media impressions across all platforms. The hashtag airline accountability was trending globally, with millions of travelers sharing their own experiences of discriminatory treatment by airline personnel. The viral nature of the story was forcing aviation industry leaders to acknowledge problems they had previously ignored or minimized. Rebecca Martinez, a civil rights attorney from Los Angeles, had experienced similar discrimination on 3 separate flights over the past year. She posted a video response to the Williams family incident, describing how she had been questioned about her right to occupy first-class seats despite holding valid tickets and practicing law for 15 years. Her testimony added credibility to claims that the Denver incident represented systemic rather than isolated bias. Dr. James Thompson, a cardiovascular surgeon from Atlanta, shared his experience of being subjected to additional security screening on consecutive flights while white passengers with identical tickets passed through normal procedures. His professional credentials hadn't protected him from discriminatory treatment that airline staff justified through vague references to security protocols. The personal stories flooding social media created an undeniable pattern of systematic discrimination that aviation industry executives could no longer dismiss as isolated incidents or misunderstandings. The Williams family's documented experience had opened floodgates for thousands of similar testimonials that painted a comprehensive picture of institutional bias. Congressional response was swift and bipartisan. Senator Elizabeth Warren's office contacted Marcus directly, requesting testimony for upcoming hearings on transportation industry discrimination. Republican Senator Marco Rubio, representing Florida, announced plans for comprehensive aviation civil rights legislation that would establish federal oversight of airline passenger treatment. The Department of Transportation opened formal investigations into Mountain Airways' discrimination practices, with initial findings suggesting systematic problems extending far beyond the Denver incident. Preliminary audits revealed complaint patterns indicating that minority passengers were subjected to additional scrutiny at rates significantly higher than statistical probability would suggest. Mountain Airways' stock price dropped 12% in after-hours trading as investors recognized the potential financial impact of federal investigations, civil rights lawsuits, and consumer boycotts. Competing airlines began implementing emergency bias training programs, not from ethical commitment, but from fear of experiencing similar public relations disasters. American Airlines announced a partnership with the NAACP to develop comprehensive discrimination prevention protocols. Delta established an internal passenger advocacy department with authority to investigate bias complaints and recommend corrective actions. United Airlines created a customer dignity task force charged with eliminating discriminatory practices across all operations. The rapid industry response demonstrated how quickly institutional change could occur when properly motivated by public pressure and regulatory threats. Airlines that had resisted civil rights reforms for decades suddenly discovered urgency for implementing comprehensive bias prevention programs. Marcus spent the evening coordinating with his executive team to establish the Transportation Equity Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to eliminating discrimination across all travel industries. The foundation would provide legal support for discrimination victims, fund research into bias prevention strategies, and lobby for comprehensive federal civil rights legislation. Angela used her healthcare experience to develop training protocols that would help airline employees recognize and prevent discriminatory behavior. Her work with diverse patient populations at Denver General Hospital had taught her effective strategies for ensuring equitable treatment regardless of race, socioeconomic status, or cultural background. Zoe Williams, now with over 1 million followers on social media due to her documentation of the discrimination incident, began using her platform to educate young people about civil rights and institutional bias. Her teenage perspective on experiencing discrimination firsthand resonated with a generation that had grown up believing such behavior was relegated to history books. The foundation's initial funding came from Marcus's personal commitment of $100 million, but corporate contributions quickly swelled the endowment to over $300 million as companies sought to distance themselves from discrimination practices and demonstrate commitment to civil rights. Legal experts predicted that the Williams family's case would establish new precedents for corporate accountability in discrimination cases. Professor Sandra Davis of Harvard Law School noted that the incident demonstrated how modern technology and social media could transform individual experiences of bias into movements for systematic change. The case's unique aspects included comprehensive documentation through security cameras and passenger recordings, clear evidence of differential treatment based on race, and the power dynamic reversal when Marcus's corporate position was revealed. These elements created an ideal foundation for establishing legal precedents that would protect future discrimination victims. International aviation authorities took notice as the story spread globally. European airlines began implementing similar bias prevention programs after several incidents involving American passengers who documented discriminatory treatment and threatened boycotts. The global travel industry recognized that discrimination incidents could instantly become international news in the social media age. The Williams family's experience sparked academic research into systematic airline discrimination. Universities began studying complaint patterns, passenger treatment data, and employee training protocols to identify institutional factors that enabled bias to flourish without oversight or accountability. Dr. Patricia Johnson of Stanford University's Civil Rights Institute launched a comprehensive study of airline passenger treatment patterns over the past decade. Preliminary findings suggested that minority passengers were subjected to additional scrutiny, delayed boarding, and service degradation at rates that couldn't be explained by random variation or legitimate security concerns. The research provided empirical evidence supporting anecdotal accounts of discrimination that airlines had previously dismissed as isolated incidents or passenger misperceptions. Academic validation of systematic bias patterns strengthened legal cases and legislative initiatives aimed at comprehensive industry reform. Mountain Airways faced cascading consequences beyond individual terminations and federal investigations. Shareholder lawsuits alleged that discriminatory practices created legal and financial risks that management had failed to disclose adequately. Class action attorneys were organizing discrimination victims into litigation groups, seeking comprehensive damages and institutional reforms. The airline's insurance carriers began reviewing coverage for civil rights violations, potentially leaving Mountain Airways financially exposed for discrimination-related settlements and judgments. Credit rating agencies placed the company under review for possible downgrades due to legal and regulatory risks that could affect long-term financial stability. Corporate customers with diversity initiatives began canceling contracts with Mountain Airways, choosing competitors who demonstrated stronger commitments to civil rights and inclusive customer service. The business impact extended beyond individual passenger bookings to corporate accounts worth millions in annual revenue. By midnight, 12 hours after the discrimination incident at Denver International Airport, the Williams family had transformed their personal experience into a national movement for transportation industry civil rights reform. Federal investigations were underway, congressional hearings were scheduled, and comprehensive legislation was being drafted to prevent similar discrimination against future passengers. Marcus stood on the balcony overlooking Miami's skyline, reflecting on how quickly individual courage and institutional power could create systematic change when properly coordinated. The discrimination his family had endured was unacceptable, but their response was creating protections for millions of travelers who would never face similar bias. Angela joined him on the balcony, checking on Tyler, who had fallen asleep while playing with his airplane toy. Their son's innocence had been touched by discrimination, but his questions had helped adults understand the human impact of institutional bias. The 8-year-old's desire to simply board an airplane with his family had become a symbol of basic dignity that every passenger deserved. Tomorrow would bring congressional testimony, media interviews, and continued coordination with civil rights organizations working to implement comprehensive aviation industry reforms. But tonight, the Williams family could rest knowing that their courage in facing discrimination had created lasting change that would protect countless other families from experiencing similar bias. The systematic transformation of an entire industry had begun with one family's refusal to accept discriminatory treatment as normal or inevitable. Real change was possible when individual courage met institutional power and public accountability. 6 weeks after the Denver discrimination incident, Marcus Williams stood before the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation in a packed hearing room on Capitol Hill. The committee's investigation into systematic airline discrimination had attracted national media attention and bipartisan political support that surprised even seasoned civil rights advocates. Committee Chair Senator Amy Klobuchar opened the hearing with remarks that framed the Williams family's experience within broader patterns of transportation industry bias. The discrimination documented at Denver International Airport represents just one visible example of systematic problems that have affected millions of American travelers, she announced to the overflow crowd of reporters, civil rights advocates, and airline industry representatives. Marcus's testimony drew from comprehensive research conducted by the Transportation Equity Foundation, which had documented over 12,000 similar discrimination incidents across all major airlines during the previous 5 years. The data revealed patterns that airline executives could no longer dismiss as isolated misunderstandings or employee training failures. Senator Ted Cruz, ranking Republican member of the committee, questioned Marcus about the economic impact of discrimination on airline profitability and competitiveness. The evidence suggests that discriminatory practices create significant legal and financial risks for airlines, while damaging their reputation among increasingly diverse customer bases, Marcus replied, citing research showing correlation between bias incidents and decreased market share. The hearing featured testimony from Dr. Carmen Rodriguez, a trauma surgeon from Phoenix, who had been removed from a flight for speaking Spanish to her mother during a phone call. Airport security had detained her for 2 hours, despite her medical credentials and fluent English, demonstrating how discrimination affected professionals across multiple industries and backgrounds. Angela Williams testified about the psychological impact of discrimination on children, drawing from her healthcare experience with families affected by institutional bias. When children see their parents treated as suspects for existing in spaces they've paid to occupy, she told the committee, it creates lasting trauma that affects their understanding of justice, fairness, and their place in American society. The committee heard from James Patterson, a former Mountain Airways employee who had witnessed multiple discrimination incidents but had been discouraged from reporting them through official channels. Company culture emphasized passenger compliance over passenger rights, he testified, describing training that taught employees to view certain passengers as inherently problematic rather than addressing their own biases. International observers attended the hearings, recognizing that American airline discrimination practices affected global travel patterns and international business relationships. European aviation officials testified about implementing bias prevention programs after American business travelers had documented discriminatory treatment on U.S. carriers, leading to corporate travel policy changes that cost airlines millions in lost revenue. The ripple effects extended beyond aviation into other transportation industries facing similar bias issues. Rental car companies began reviewing policies after customers documented discriminatory vehicle assignment practices. Hotel chains implemented bias training programs following incidents where minority guests were questioned about their room reservations despite valid confirmations.
Railroad companies, maritime transportation providers, and ride-sharing services all faced increased scrutiny as the transportation discrimination investigation expanded beyond airlines. The Williams family's experience had opened a Pandora's box of institutional bias that affected every aspect of American travel and mobility. Educational institutions began incorporating the Denver incident into civil rights curricula, using the documented discrimination and subsequent reforms as case studies in how individual courage could drive systematic change. Law schools analyzed the legal precedents being established, while business schools examined the corporate crisis management and institutional transformation processes. Harvard Business School professor Michael Chen developed a comprehensive case study examining how Williams Aviation Holdings had leveraged corporate power for social justice rather than personal revenge. The case became required reading for students studying stakeholder capitalism and corporate social responsibility, demonstrating how business leaders could address systematic inequities. The Transportation Equity Foundation's legal support program had filed discrimination lawsuits against 17 airlines by the 6-week mark, creating a network of cases that established consistent legal precedents for passenger rights and airline accountability. The foundation's attorneys worked pro bono for discrimination victims who lacked resources to fight institutional bias independently. Airline employee unions found themselves in difficult positions as discrimination cases exposed systematic problems in training, culture, and management oversight. The Association of Flight Attendants condemned discriminatory behavior while calling for comprehensive bias prevention training that would protect both passengers and employees from the consequences of institutional prejudice. Some union representatives argued that individual employees were being scapegoated for systematic problems created by corporate policies and inadequate training. Others recognized that protecting discriminatory behavior ultimately harmed all workers by creating legal and financial risks that threatened job security across the industry. The Federal Aviation Administration announced new regulatory requirements mandating annual civil rights audits for all commercial airlines, with significant financial penalties for carriers that demonstrated patterns of discriminatory passenger treatment. The regulations included anonymous reporting systems for bias incidents and mandatory bias prevention training for all customer-facing employees. State attorneys general from 37 states joined a coordinated investigation into airline discrimination practices, seeking damages for residents who had experienced bias while traveling. The multi-state legal action created additional pressure for comprehensive industry reforms beyond federal regulatory requirements. Corporate America responded to the transportation discrimination crisis by reviewing their own travel policies and vendor relationships. Companies with diversity and inclusion commitments began requiring airlines to demonstrate bias prevention measures before approving corporate travel contracts, creating market pressure for systematic reforms. Technology companies developed bias detection software that analyzed passenger treatment patterns, customer complaints, and employee behavior to identify discriminatory practices before they became viral incidents. Airlines began implementing these systems as both legal protection and reputation management tools. The Williams family's story inspired similar revelations in healthcare, retail, hospitality, and financial services industries. Employees began documenting and reporting discriminatory practices they had previously accepted as normal business operations, creating accountability pressure across multiple sectors of the American economy. Social media platforms modified their algorithms to promote civil rights content and discriminatory incident documentation, recognizing their role in amplifying individual experiences into movements for systematic change. The platforms faced criticism for previously suppressing such content, while promoting it only after it became profitable. International human rights organizations began monitoring American transportation discrimination as part of broader civil rights assessments. The United Nations Human Rights Council included airline bias in reports on systematic racism in the United States, creating diplomatic pressure for comprehensive federal civil rights legislation. Academic researchers from multiple universities collaborated on longitudinal studies tracking discrimination incident patterns, victim impact, and institutional response effectiveness. The research provided empirical foundations for policy recommendations and legal strategies that would protect future travelers from bias.
The Denver incident's global reach surprised even civil rights veterans who had worked on discrimination cases for decades. Social media amplification, international business relationships, and interconnected transportation systems had transformed a single family's experience into a worldwide examination of institutional bias and accountability. Foreign airlines began requiring bias prevention training for employees serving American routes, recognizing that discrimination incidents involving American passengers could generate international boycotts and regulatory sanctions. The global aviation industry acknowledged that bias anywhere could affect business everywhere in an interconnected world. Restaurant and retail industries near airports implemented their own bias prevention programs after recognizing that transportation discrimination often extended into adjacent businesses serving diverse traveler populations. The ripple effects reached far beyond airlines into entire transportation ecosystems. Corporate diversity officers from Fortune 500 companies began incorporating travel discrimination into their bias prevention training programs, recognizing that business travel experiences affected employee satisfaction, retention, and productivity. The intersection of workplace equity and travel rights created new areas of corporate social responsibility. The Williams family's experience had demonstrated how systematic discrimination operated across multiple institutions, while showing how individual courage, combined with corporate power and public accountability, could drive rapid change. Their story became a template for addressing institutional bias in industries that had resisted civil rights reforms for decades. As Marcus concluded his congressional testimony, he reflected on how 6 weeks of coordinated action had transformed a personal experience of discrimination into a national movement for transportation industry reform. The work was far from complete, but the foundation for lasting change had been established through comprehensive legal, regulatory, and cultural transformations. The ripple effects would continue expanding as other industries recognized that systematic bias created legal, financial, and reputational risks that could no longer be ignored in an era of social media accountability and global interconnectedness. Real change required sustained commitment, but the Denver incident had proven that such change was possible when properly coordinated and resourced. 1 year after the discrimination incident at Denver International Airport, Marcus Williams stood before the annual National Urban League Convention in Detroit, addressing an audience of 3,000 civil rights leaders, community activists, and young advocates who had followed the Transportation Equity Foundation's work throughout the previous 12 months. The convention hall erupted in sustained applause as Marcus reflected on the journey from passenger discrimination to industry transformation. Change is possible when individual courage meets institutional accountability, he told the audience. But lasting progress requires sustained commitment from every person who believes that dignity and respect are not negotiable rights that depend on corporate position or social status. The Williams family's story had become a cornerstone case study in modern civil rights advocacy, demonstrating how personal experiences of discrimination could be transformed into systematic institutional reform when properly documented, legally supported, and strategically amplified through media and political channels. Angela Williams had used her healthcare background to develop bias prevention training protocols now implemented across the aviation industry. Her work at Denver General Hospital with diverse patient populations provided practical frameworks for ensuring equitable treatment regardless of race, background, or perceived social status. The training programs Angela designed went beyond simple sensitivity workshops to include scenario-based learning, implicit bias recognition, and cultural competency development that addressed root causes of discriminatory behavior rather than merely symptoms. Airlines reported significant reductions in bias-related complaints after implementing her comprehensive educational approaches. Zoe Williams, now 16 and with over 5 million social media followers, had become a leading voice for youth civil rights advocacy. Her documentation of the family's discrimination experience had evolved into a platform for educating young people about institutional bias, legal rights, and effective strategies for challenging systematic injustice. Through partnerships with civil rights organizations and educational institutions, Zoe developed digital literacy programs that taught students how to document discrimination incidents safely and effectively while understanding their legal rights and available resources for seeking accountability and redress.
Tyler Williams, now 9 years old, had become an inadvertent symbol of childhood innocence confronting adult prejudice. His simple questions during the discrimination incident had highlighted the human impact of institutional bias on families and children who experience systematic unfairness while seeking basic services and respect. The Transportation Equity Foundation had documented over 50,000 discrimination incidents across all major airlines during its first year of operation, revealing systematic patterns that industry executives could no longer dismiss as isolated employee training failures or passenger misunderstandings. Legal victories accumulated steadily as Foundation attorneys established precedents protecting passenger rights and holding airlines accountable for discriminatory treatment. The average settlement for documented bias cases reached $150,000, while systematic reform agreements required comprehensive policy changes and ongoing civil rights monitoring. Federal legislation passed 8 months after the Denver incident established the Passenger Rights and Dignity Act, creating enforceable standards for airline treatment of all travelers, regardless of race, religion, national origin, or socioeconomic status. The law included significant financial penalties for carriers demonstrating patterns of discriminatory behavior. The Act's implementation required airlines to maintain detailed records of passenger complaints, undergo annual civil rights audits, and provide transparent reporting on bias prevention training effectiveness. Companies failing to meet federal standards faced operating license suspension and substantial financial sanctions. International adoption of similar passenger rights legislation occurred across European Union countries, Canada, Australia, and several Asian nations, recognizing that transportation discrimination affected global business relationships and tourism revenue. The Williams family's experience had influenced aviation policy on multiple continents. Academic research programs established at major universities continued studying discrimination patterns, victim impact, and institutional response effectiveness. The empirical data provided foundations for policy recommendations and legal strategies protecting future travelers from bias while holding transportation companies accountable for equitable treatment. Dr. Patricia Johnson's Stanford University research team published comprehensive findings showing dramatic reductions in discrimination incidents following implementation of bias prevention training, accountability measures, and federal oversight requirements established after the Denver case. The study documented a 73% decrease in documented bias incidents across airlines implementing comprehensive reform programs, while carriers resisting change experienced increased complaints, legal challenges, and financial losses from discrimination-related litigation and regulatory sanctions. Corporate America had integrated transportation discrimination prevention into broader diversity and inclusion initiatives, recognizing that travel experiences affected employee satisfaction, recruitment, and retention. Companies required airline partners to demonstrate bias prevention measures before approving corporate travel contracts worth millions in annual revenue. The economic impact extended beyond individual carriers to entire airport ecosystems as restaurants, retail establishments, and service providers implemented bias prevention training, recognizing that discrimination anywhere affected business everywhere in interconnected transportation environments. Technology innovations emerged from the civil rights movement as companies developed bias detection software, anonymous reporting systems, and cultural competency training platforms that helped institutions identify and address discriminatory practices before they became viral incidents or legal challenges. Artificial intelligence systems analyzed passenger treatment patterns, employee behavior data, and customer complaint trends to flag potential bias incidents while they were developing, allowing proactive intervention rather than reactive damage control after discrimination had already occurred. The Williams family's vacation that had been interrupted by discrimination at Denver International Airport had ultimately provided them with a mission that transformed their personal experience into lasting institutional change affecting millions of travelers worldwide. Marcus reflected on how their response to discrimination had created protections for countless families who would never experience similar bias because systematic reforms had been implemented across the transportation industry. Individual courage had generated collective progress that would benefit future generations. During a quiet moment after his Urban League speech, Marcus visited the Detroit neighborhood where he had grown up, walking streets where his own father had experienced discrimination that seemed insurmountable at the time. The progress achieved through the Transportation Equity Foundation demonstrated how individual experiences could drive systematic change when properly supported and strategically coordinated. Angela continued her nursing career at Denver General Hospital while serving on the foundation's board of directors, ensuring that healthcare perspectives informed civil rights advocacy and that bias prevention strategies developed for aviation could be adapted for medical settings where discrimination also affected patient outcomes and family experiences. The Foundation's scholarship program had provided educational opportunities for 500 students pursuing careers in civil rights law, public policy, and social justice advocacy. These young people represented the next generation of leaders who would continue advancing equality and accountability across American institutions. As the Williams family prepared for their second attempt at a Miami vacation, this time without discrimination or corporate crisis management, they reflected on how one family's refusal to accept bias as normal had created lasting change, protecting millions of travelers from similar experiences. The flight to Miami proceeded without incident, with airline staff providing professional courtesy based on respect rather than fear. Other passengers boarded efficiently, families traveled safely, and children experienced the joy of air travel without witnessing discrimination against their parents or other travelers. Tyler played with his toy airplane during the flight, unaware that his innocent questions a year earlier had helped adults understand the human impact of institutional bias. His excitement about flying remained pure, protected by reforms that ensured other children would share his joy rather than his confusion about why some families were treated differently. The Transportation Equity Foundation's work continued expanding into other industries where discrimination affected American families seeking basic services and respect. Housing, healthcare, education, and financial services all faced increased scrutiny as the civil rights movement recognized that discrimination was systematic rather than isolated to specific sectors. Marcus Williams had learned that real change required sustained commitment beyond initial victories and media attention. The Foundation's ongoing mission focused on preventing discrimination rather than simply responding to it, creating institutional cultures where bias could not flourish without immediate accountability and correction. The legacy of the Denver discrimination incident was measured not in individual careers destroyed or corporate settlements achieved, but in millions of families who would travel safely and respectfully because one family had refused to accept bias as inevitable or acceptable in American transportation.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.